Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. No Otopoti ahau, ko Richard Blakey tāka wingawa. He ka mahi aha te whare wānanga o tāko. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora and welcome everyone. My name is Richard Blakey. I am the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Research and Enterprise. It's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you here tonight to this inaugural professorial lecture for Professor Janine Haywood. Welcome, I believe, to Your Worship the Mayor, who may be joining us tonight, members of the Dunedin community, colleagues from the University of Otago, and in particular to friends and whānau of Janine, your mother Jan, is here from Christchurch, your aunt and uncle Mary and Morris Brown from Wellington, husband Paul, and in particular your sons Jamie and Charlie. Welcome, welcome, welcome to you all. The order of ceremonies is that I will be making a few words of welcome on behalf of the university and then hand over to the Pro-Vice-Chancellor in the Division of Humanities to introduce the speaker for you. Then we'll have the IPL, some remarks at the end, and there will be an invitation to retire to the staff club for refreshments afterwards. Now, to put this in context, an IPL, an inaugural professorial lecture, is a celebration of all that it means to become a professor here at the University of Otago, whether by appointment or by promotion from our own ranks. From our founding four professors, Scott, Shand, Black and Sale, we have set very high standards for our professors to show sustained, outstanding leadership and competence in at least two of our core activities of teaching, research and service, and a mere sustained excellence in the third. So one cannot compromise excellence in any of these three pillars of our professional practice in order to gain this highest of our academic statuses in the university. And when these standards are met, it's worthwhile putting on the ritz, putting on our gowns, getting our regalia out, calling our leaders together. I should say welcome to the Vice-Chancellor as well, who is here with us tonight. And celebrating. We're here as a celebration, not only to hear the scholarship and the research that has led to this promotion, but together in celebration of what it means to be a professor here at the University of Otago. And that's why we also put on just a light function afterwards at the staff club. There's also a selfish exercise, though, for those of us in senior academic leadership roles, because it does give us a chance to switch off our cell phones, and those of you who may have yours switched on, I'd advise you to do the same. Forget about everything else for an hour at the end of a working day, and to bask in the work and the achievements of some of our finest minds, or one of our finest minds. It's an academic spa time for us, if you like. So my duty here tonight is on the behalf of the Vice-Chancellor to set the scene and then hand over to Tony, and to introduce, just in a general sense, the kinds of things that have led to Professor Haywood's promotion. As I've indicated already, we set very high standards for determining whether or not one of our own academic staff members can join our professoriate. And in this process, we not only rely on an internal staffing committee, a promotions committee, but we seek the views of many others, including the views of leading international experts. Professor Haywood, whose expertise in the rich tapestry of New Zealand politics, especially to Tiriti o te Waitangi, that we'll be hearing about tonight, has not only contributed, as we found out through our referees, to the national conversation, but has made a global impact with the scholarship. In the context that from what we learn about ourselves and our political history can also inform others about their place in the world too. An example from one of Janine's international referees highlights this in stating, not about the Tiriti, I'll get to that in a moment, but that papers from Janine analysing citizen assemblies and juxtaposing them as potential models for New Zealand practice have opened new perspectives on their strengths and weaknesses in a way that studies of how they have worked in other jurisdictions have not. In other words, what we have learned about ourselves has informed others about their place in the world. And also from international referees, Janine's contributions to New Zealand through her work on Te Tiriti are in many ways the shining lights that we're going to hear about tonight. where both New Zealand and international referees recognise that, quote, her publications that are most recognised and cited are those on Te Tiriti and the politics of the Constitution, and that she is widely recognised as one of the world's leading authorities on our democratic and constitutional practice. So I think that you will agree with me that those kind of comments, independently obtained from international experts, are worthy of your promotion, Janine, and confirm the wisdom of the Vice-Chancellor in confirming your appointment. No matter what our international experts and our own advisory committees give us advice, it is a promotion that the Vice-Chancellor endorses. So with that, I will now invite Professor Tony Ballantyne to give a little bit more detail of your background and introduce you as the speaker. Thank you very much.
So, tēnā koutou katoa, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Janine Haywood, who is, of course, a Professor of Politics and the current head of the Department of Politics here at the University. Janine was born and raised in Christchurch. I was talking to her today and I was going to ask her what school she went to, which is a very Christchurch question, but I skirted around that. Her undergraduate studies were undertaken at the University of Canterbury and she completed her PhD at Victoria University. She came to Otago in 1998 after working at the Waitangi Tribunal, and here at the university she researches and teaches very widely with expertise in New Zealand politics, environmental and treaty politics, electoral studies, local government and resource management. But she also has significant ties to Canada, both the Simon Fraser University and the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Now those Canadian connections underpin the teaching she's undertaken on comparative Canadian politics, as well as her research relating to Indigenous and state relations, electoral reform, and citizens' assemblies in Canada. Now today when I was chatting to Janine, I asked her how she got interested in politics. She suggested that in part the answer lies with her upbringing. Her parents were interested in education and in the environment, and there were lots of conversations about justice in their house. Now that concern with justice has threaded through her New Zealand-focused research. She has produced an arc of influential edited collections, chapters and journal articles exploring New Zealand politics, the relationship between media and politics in particular, local government and the significance of the treaty, and also the Waitangi Tribunal and the treaty settlement processes. For Janine, research is not just some abstract intellectual activity confined to her office and to the library, but rather she has been very committed to using her knowledge of local politics and the electoral system to enhance our democracy. She has worked with local government in Dunedin and elsewhere on electoral systems, and in 2015 chaired the DCC Representation Review. And this year, Janine worked with the University and the Electoral Commission on a comprehensive campus campaign to boost student voter turnout. Now, I think one other thing that's very important to say about Janine is that she's a truly great colleague. She is thoughtful, she is generous, and she is an excellent institutional citizen. She works very well with others. Sorry, that does sound like a primary school report, doesn't it? But it's true, Janine. And I think it's very important to note her really exceptional record of research collaboration. And I think it would be very nice just to note two of those collaborations in particular. One is with her colleague in politics, Chris Rudd, which has seen them co-edit 2 volumes of essays and share teaching and supervision. And the other's with Nicola Ween in law, which again has seen them co-edit 2 volumes, one on the Waitangi Tribunal and one on treaty settlements, both published by Bridget Williams Books. The treaty, of course, is the focus of Janine's lecture tonight, and I'm delighted to hand over to her. So could you please join me in welcoming Professor Hayward.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Ki ngā mate o te wā o ngā tau, haere atu rā e te hunga ora. He mihi nui ki a koutou katoa, rau rangatira mā. He mihi tēnei ki te mana whenua o tēnei rohe. Ki ngā kaimahi o te tari tōranga pū. Ki ngā kaimahi o te whare wānanga nei. Ki taku whānau no o te pōti, no o tautahi, no te whanganui a tara hoki. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I've been asked to speak to you today about my research journey, but from my perspective standing here, I can actually see quite a lot of that journey myself in the faces of lots of the people gathered here, and I would like to thank you all very much for coming along, to colleagues, to community members, to students that I can see, and certainly friends. Thank you so much for your presence here. I'd particularly like to acknowledge my family from out of town, my mum and my husband Paul, and also our two boys who have come along to support me despite suspecting that I'm going to be really boring. Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, has sat at the centre of my passion for New Zealand politics since my undergraduate days at the University of Otago. My PhD at Victoria University in the mid-1990s was a wonderful excuse to learn everything I could about New Zealand politics and how it's been shaped by and at the same time marginalised the agreement made in 1840. My supervisor was Professor Elizabeth Macleay, and while at the time I valued her academic guidance, in hindsight, I've also come to appreciate her influence as a role model for me as a woman in the field of political science. After my PhD, I worked for 2 years at the Waitangi Tribunal with historian Alan Ward on an overview of treaty breaches across Aotearoa, New Zealand. The purpose of the project was to allow the Waitangi Tribunal to anticipate the work that it had ahead of it and to send a message to government that the task of redressing treaty grievances would likely be much larger than it was originally anticipated. The National Overview Project, Rangahaua Whānui, gave me an appreciation of the vast and at the same time intensely personal grievances Māori carry in all regions as a result of our colonial history. When I came to the Department of Politics at Otago in 1998, I was determined to bring the treaty and my experiences at the Waitangi Tribunal into my teaching and into my research, and more importantly, into political science, a discipline where it had long been neglected. My target audience was the predominantly Pākehā students studying politics at Otago. My early experiences of talking with those students about the treaty were, on reflection now, rather shaky. I vividly recall one particular occasion in my first few years of teaching when around 10 students made a point of very noisily getting up and leaving the lecture theatre as I talked about the treaty and our colonial history. They weren't expecting New Zealand politics to include discussion of the treaty, and they made it clear through walking out and through their subsequent charming comments on course evaluations that they objected strongly to having to listen to it. I found it disturbing to encounter such bold resistance from young minds that should be open to learning. I'm forever grateful to the support of my colleagues in the politics department and at Te Tumu, which became my second home as I found my feet and stayed the course. Things have changed a lot since those days. When I talk about the treaty today, students don't leave the class in protest. I now teach a paper specifically about treaty politics to a large group of students, some of whom I can see here today, who are extremely ideologically diverse, and diverse in many ways. They generally agree on the significance of the treaty to contemporary politics, even if they don't agree on the appropriate ways to address the treaty challenges we face as a nation. Many of my other research interests are somehow related to the treaty. I've written about local government and environmental management, largely because it's impossible to talk about these things without talking about treaty obligations. I'm deeply interested in electoral systems, Again, largely because these are important tools in achieving representation that reflects the treaty relationship. I've spent a considerable amount of time in Canada, as was mentioned earlier, with the family happily in tow, learning about the experiences of First Nations on the west coast of Canada in particular. I've learned more about New Zealand by leaving its shores and seeing it from a distance through the eyes of other people than I ever would have learned by staying at home. So given the opportunity to talk to you all, naturally I felt inclined to talk about the treaty. But rather than talk about the research I have done, I wanted to talk about one idea that has consistently guided my approach to that research and which still gives me optimism today. That idea is that our political future is in many ways determined by the capacity and limits of our political imagination. When I was writing my PhD, I had the final 2 lines from an Alan Curnow poem that I'd studied in New Zealand literature, my second love, stuck to the side of my Mac SE computer screen. It was a source of inspiration to me, and it remains so today. These lines come from his poem, The Skeleton of the Great Moa in the Canterbury Museum, Christchurch, and they read, "Not I, some child born in a marvellous year, will learn the trick of standing upright here." Something about those words captured my imagination then and continue to intrigue me today. My research journey with the Treaty of Waitangi could be described as an endless quest to understand what the treaty can tell us about the trick of standing upright here. For those of you unfamiliar with the treaty, I'll give you a few essential facts and related thoughts, a quick Treaty 101, and my apologies for those of you whom this is very familiar. Better be familiar to my students. The treaty was signed at Waitangi on February 6, 1840 by Maori rangatira and a representative of the British sovereign. It has 3 short articles, written in both Te Reo Māori and in English. If people know anything about the treaty, they usually know that the English version, the treaty, is different in very significant ways from the version in Te Reo Māori, Te Tiriti. The first 2 articles are most significant to my discussion, so I'll just briefly describe them. Article 1 of Te Tiriti, the Māori version of the treaty, says, in translation, that the chiefs give up to the Queen of England forever the government, kawanatanga, of their lands. In the English version, the treaty declares the chiefs cede to Her Majesty, the Queen of England, absolutely all the rights and powers of sovereignty, which the chiefs exercise or possess. In Article 2 of Te Tiriti, again in translation, the Queen of England arranges and agrees to the full chieftainship of the chiefs, tino rangatiratanga, over their lands, settlements, and all their treasures. While in English, the treaty promises that Her Majesty confirms and guarantees to the chiefs and tribes the full, exclusive, and undisturbed possession of their lands and forests, as long as they wish and desire to retain the same in their possession. I could talk for a very long time about the circumstances surrounding the treaty and the meaning of those words, but I won't. Instead, I want to draw your attention to the 2 very different visions of future New Zealand presented by Te Tiriti and the treaty in 1840. Visions held by Māori rangatira on the one hand and the British on the other. Through Te Tiriti, Māori rangatira understood that they would continue to exercise absolute authority, tino rangatiratanga, over their lands and their peoples, and indeed that the Crown would protect their right to do so. Through the treaty, on the other hand, the Crown assumed not only the right to govern, but the right to exercise absolute sovereignty. To cut a fascinating, complex, and long story unsatisfactorily short, the coexistence of Māori tino rangatiratanga and Crown sovereignty created tension after 1840. The Crown overcame this tension by using its legislative and political authority to undermine and marginalise the rights Te Tiriti had guaranteed to Māori. These treaty breaches have been acknowledged by our governments. The Crown has apologised for its actions and inactions which breached the treaty, and grievances are being addressed and redressed through treaty settlements. But other aspects of the treaty relationship remain unresolved. One fundamental and ongoing challenge of particular interest to me is the relationship between Te Tiriti and the Constitution itself. As a nation, we don't talk much about our Constitution. In fact, many people think New Zealand doesn't have a constitution, or at least not a proper one. This is not true. A constitution is simply the rules and norms relating to the exercise and limits of power in a society. And New Zealand has all the rules and norms it needs to function as a nation, even if it sometimes doesn't feel like it. It has a constitution, but unlike countries such as the USA, our constitution is not written down in one place. It's spread throughout Acts of Parliament, regulations, and even exists in unwritten political conventions. In this regard, we are fairly unique. So, for example, the Constitution Act talks about our sovereign, Parliament, legislature, and courts. The Bill of Rights sets out our rights and freedoms. The Electoral Act provides the rules of elections. And the Cabinet Office Manual, which isn't law at all, talks about the caretaker government and government formation, amongst other things, and so on and so on. When we talk about New Zealand's constitution, we're simply talking about all of these rules and many others that relate to the exercise of political power and the limits to that power. So what relationship does Te Tiriti or Waitangi have with the Constitution? And more importantly, what relationship should it have? This is a matter of debate. Many people, our governments included, talk about the treaty as a founding document in New Zealand, but others deny that it has any place in our contemporary politics at all. The treaty itself is not law, but whenever the Constitution is discussed, the treaty and its relevance to political power and the limits to that power becomes a central point of debate. I've watched this debate unfold for the last 20 years, and in many ways, it has made remarkably little progress. I'm fascinated by the question of how we might reconcile very different visions of our constitutional future in relation to the treaty. So for the time remaining, I want to talk about two particular constitutional futures that have been recently proposed and think about how we might bring those conversations together in a common vision. But first, a few thoughts about the ideas that shape the way we think about our constitution today. In 1996, legal history scholar Paul McHugh wrote a paper called Constitutional Voices, which has greatly influenced my thinking about our constitution. McHugh suggested that the language we use to talk about our constitution both reflects our current culture and affects the character of our future thoughts and actions. This is a simple and persuasive idea, referred to sometimes today as setting the narrative. The language we use determines the conversations we can have. If we don't share the language required to conceive of and communicate ideas, it makes it much less likely that alternatives unfamiliar to us can be considered and given life. It makes it harder for us to talk to each other and be understood. McHugh wrote this article at a pivotal time in New Zealand's treaty history, soon after the courts had made their first landmark judgments about the treaty in the late 1980s, but before the first of the major treaty settlements had been achieved in the late 1990s. His point overall was to say that most New Zealanders were simply unaware that Maori conceive of a political future that fundamentally challenges the notion of Crown sovereignty. McHugh argued that New Zealanders instead are reared to think in terms of a singular and absolute Crown in Parliament, and to assume that we have cultural uniformity and an undifferentiated population. In this powerful narrative, he explained, the Crown's sovereignty is indivisible and absolute, and deemed always to have been present, and most certainly beyond refute. Our colonial history tells a tale of New Zealand's development from a fledgling colony to an adolescent dominion maturing into full independent statehood. As many other scholars have also acknowledged, the language used to talk about our Westminster tradition draws heavily on the concepts of pragmatism and egalitarianism as significant cultural values underpinning New Zealand's constitution and political tradition. When I teach New Zealand politics, I use this narrative myself. It is a simple explanation which McHugh describes as having reassuring fireside tone. He says its thrall is so complete that it is impossible to conceive of national history beyond that process. But as McHugh notes, this narrative is not reassuring for everyone. Aotearoa New Zealand is a nation of dual, if not multiple, histories, often running in parallel to each other. The dominant narrative, which normalises the Crown, at the same time marginalises Maori and denies the treaty any foundational status and constitutional presence. As McHugh warned in 1996, through this view of our history and our present, Maori become irrelevant and the problem presented by their cultural difference no more than a hiccup in national growth. McHugh anticipated that Maori treaty claims and settlements that acknowledge the Crown's wrongdoing and address those grievances would ultimately also fundamentally challenge the Crown's sovereignty. He said that treaty claims posit the existence of a legitimate source of authority independent of the Crown. In 2015, the Waitangi Tribunal did as McHugh predicted and concluded in regard to the Northland inquiry that the rangatira who signed Te Tiriti o Waitangi in February 1840 did not cede their sovereignty to Britain. That is, they did not cede authority to make and enforce law over people and territories, over their people and territories. As McHugh also predicted, the Waitangi Tribunal's findings were met with fierce resistance from government and the public. Discussion of the possibility of a source of sovereignty beyond the Crown was dismissed as fanciful and dangerously divisive, and the discussion was short-lived. The narrative of the absolute and singular Crown quickly won the day. But the thrall of the Crown's authority is far from complete. Te Rarawa legal scholar Mamari Stevens argues that there is a long-established, distinctive and evolving Maori constitutional tradition with values that are directly relevant to the practice of New Zealand's constitution. Carwyn Jones, a Ngāti Kahungunu and Te Aitangi Māhaki legal scholar, similarly describes a Maori constitutional tradition sourced in tikanga, or the correct way of doing things, in Maori society. He explains that the Maori constitutional tradition embodies 5 values: whanaungatanga, relationships; manaakitanga and kaitiakitanga, looking after people and an ethic of guardianship; mana, or spiritually sanctioned authority, and limits to that authority; tapu and noa, the spiritual character of all things; and utu, balance and reciprocity. Jones notes, these key institutions embody both values and practice. They transmit information about the correct way of behaving from one generation to the next and provide reasoned responses to constitutional questions, from how to place limits on law-making authority to how a person or body exercising public power should react to a given set of circumstances. We have, therefore, in New Zealand, 2 sources of political authority, Māori and the Crown, and each source is inspired by distinctive values and principles which guide the appropriate use of power and limits to that power. Despite the overwhelming dominance of the Crown's narrative, Māori constitutionalism survives independent of the Crown, and recently it has begun to call for recognition. My interest in thinking about these distinctive constitutional traditions is how we might bring them together, and whether doing so is some part of the trick to standing upright here. The first of these constitutional futures, drawn from Māori constitutional tradition, formally emerged in 2010, led by Professors Moana Jackson and Margaret Mutu, on behalf of an independent working group supported by iwi and Māori organisations. Their purpose is to develop and implement a model for an inclusive constitution for Aotearoa based on tikanga and kawa and Te Tiriti or Waitangi. The working group conducted an impressive 252 hui within Maori communities around the country from 2012 to 2015. A Rōpū Rangatahi, a youth arm of the working group, convened a further 70 wānanga workshops with young people. I saw a demonstration of the Rangatahi workshops in action some years ago and was incredibly inspired by the way that it brought the Constitution down to earth and empowered Māori rangatahi to talk about the political forces that have shaped our past and the ideas and values that matter to them in imagining their political future. The report that was produced from these hui, Matike Mai, was released in 2016. It describes itself as a part of a constitutional transformation that has been taking place amongst Māori for the past 170 years. The report talks about a very real desire for more open constitutionalism and a conciliatory and consensual democracy rather than an adversarial and majoritarian one. It proposes 5 alternative constitutional models, which each differently identify spheres of influence for Māori rangatiratanga and Crown government. In each case, a third relational sphere is also imagined, where treaty relationships operate. What these models have in common is the centrality of Te Tiriti. It is the framework for the Constitution itself. According to Matike Mai, the agenda going forward is to engage with the Crown and local authorities, as well as their broader communities in the lead up to a Māori Constitutional Convention in 2021, at which time Māori will call for a Tiriti Convention to consider constitutional transformation by 2040. The report accepted that some people would find the process divisive, threatening, and unrealistic. The authors said, "The task ahead might be difficult because the only constitutional model most people know is the Westminster system established by the Crown. It seems to be the only constitutional reality, and it brooks no questioning of its primacy except on peripheral matters. In its stubborn presence, it simply seems immovable and unchallengeable." Some 20 years after McHugh had asked the question, Matike Mai is also asking if we have the capacity to imagine a different political and constitutional future. A second constitutional proposal has also recently emerged, this time very strongly influenced by our Westminster tradition. Long-time advocate for constitutional change in New Zealand, Geoffrey Palmer, has teamed up with legal scholar Andrew Butler to propose a modern constitution for New Zealand, which in their words is easy to understand, reflects New Zealand's identity and nationhood, protects rights and liberties, and prevents governments from abusing power. This includes the place of the treaty within a new constitution. The pair have published a book and established a website to accompany the proposal and to call for public submissions. With regard to the treaty, they say, "The Treaty of Waitangi is an integral part of New Zealand's constitutional arrangements. The legitimacy of the system of government we have in New Zealand owes much to the treaty. In our view, the treaty should be an essential part of any written constitution. It is essentially New Zealand's first constitutional document. The treaty is a key source of the New Zealand government's moral and political claim to legitimacy in governing the country." Palmer and Butler propose incorporating the treaty within the new constitution. They say the change will bring much needed coherency and consistency to a legally untidy situation. At present, the treatment of the treaty within the New Zealand system of government presents as ungainly, unclear, and untidy. They acknowledge that a similar attempt was made in the mid-1980s by the Labour government to recognise the treaty in a proposed Bill of Rights. As they note, Māori rejected this proposal at the time, raising fears that it would make the treaty vulnerable to amendment by government. Palmer and Butler proposed to overcome this by preventing amendment to the text of the treaty. They concede, however, that it's not clear to them whether or not Maori would reject this proposal again today because, and I quote, "They have not had the opportunity to consult with Maori to the extent necessary before proposing our draft constitution. The issues need to be addressed systematically, and we hope to have the chance to engage in much wider consultation through the next phase of the project." Matiki Mai and the Palmer and Butler proposal present, therefore, two very different constitutional visions emerging from two very different constitutional traditions. Both have been conceived of and written in the language familiar to their constitutional tradition, and both acknowledge that at some future time they will talk to each other about their proposals. But how will that happen? And how should it happen? These two constitutional conversations are being conducted largely in parallel, with language, values, and traditions that almost appear to speak past each other. Can this be reconciled? And if so, how? As McHugh noted, listening is hard to do when one is used to dominating the conversation. Real dialogue requires compromise, founded on a willingness to listen. When I think about how the Crown and Maori could listen and talk to each other about our constitution, I find the work of Canadian political theorist James Tully extremely useful. Tully says that constitutions are ongoing conversations that ought to overlap and be an interaction and a negotiation in a way that recognises difference and acknowledges interdependency. Tully's been a significant voice in conversations about modern constitution making, particularly in relation to the rights of Indigenous peoples. He talks about the politics of cultural recognition and draws attention to the spirit we bring to constitutional reform, which depends in part on the language and ideas available for us to discuss those issues. For the most part, he imagines that it's possible for groups of people with distinct constitutional traditions to have a back and forth of ideas in order to understand a different perspective and, more importantly, to find a common ground. Tully says that this process requires parties to engage in simple human interactions like, let me see if I understand you correctly. Let me rephrase what you've said as I understand it and see if you agree. No, you haven't heard me correctly. Let me try another example that might be more familiar to you. In other words, these simple human exchanges require us to be willing to use our imagination. Tully explains that this process should be guided by three important conventions: mutual recognition, consent, and cultural continuity. I want to end by talking briefly about these ideas and what they might look like in New Zealand. Tully's mutual recognition calls for the full public acknowledgement by each cultural group of the other groups of citizens in a society. This is essential to establishing a just form of constitutional discussion in which, as Tully explains, each speaker is given his or her due. Mutual recognition is achieved when all parties engaged in the constitutional discussions refer to each other in the language each party uses to refer to itself. Once mutual recognition is established, each group can then freely consent to the form of constitutional association, discussed and negotiated by the groups. The consent obtained as a result of the negotiations must enable, as the third convention, the cultural continuity of all parties. This stands in stark contrast to the view that a new constitution discontinues or extinguishes the pre-existing culture and customs of the groups engaged and makes them all one people, or that a constitution can impose rights or declare rights on behalf of other people. In Tully's model of constitution making, cultural diversity is acknowledged, celebrated, and protected. The image, oh look, that worked, Tully uses to depict this form of constitution making is this sculpture created by Haida First Nations artist Bill Reid. Standing 19 feet long and 12 feet high, the canoe holds 13 characters from Haida Gwaii mythology. As Tully explains, the characters face in different directions. they appear to be at the same time attacking and supporting each other, and they are wholly inside or outside, partly outside the canoe. But they are paddling in unison and in the same direction. The central figure who holds the staff is unknown to Haida mythology and could be anyone. In other words, no one knows who's really in charge. Tully interprets the sculpture in the context of modern constitution making and asks, what kind of dialogue does this artwork encourage humanity to engage with? For Tully, these characters represent the three conventions of mutual recognition, consent, and cultural continuity. What might these look like in the New Zealand context as the conventions that shape our constitutional future? What sort of waka would depict New Zealand's constitutional journey? Who would the characters on board be, and what would the relationships between them look like? New Zealand's waka would be distinctive to our constitutional traditions and relationships. Perhaps, for example, the unknown central character in our waka would be a woman. I've had the pleasure of meeting with Professor Tully on more than one occasion during my visits to Canada to discuss his ideas with him. Most recently, I visited him at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, and I described to him the two very different constitutional visions emerging in New Zealand from these different constitutional traditions. And I asked him directly what he thought it might look like if New Zealand were to experience contemporary constitution making of the type that he describes. What would it look like if Māori and the Crown were guided by the conventions of mutual recognition, consent, and cultural continuity? Professor Tully personifies the qualities he seeks to inspire in others. It is not for him to provide answers, but rather to help others develop the ability to find those answers themselves. In other words, he is that rare type of person, at least in my family, who prefers to listen and not speak. In response to my question, he suggested that we took a walk around the campus gardens. They were distractingly glorious. We talked more about flowering dogwoods and prehistoric ginkgo trees than we did about constitutional politics. And I shared with him my not-so-secret ambition to be a botanical gardener when I grow up. I didn't find the answers I sought that day, and I'm still thinking and still listening. Most often, my thoughts about our constitutional future lead back to Te Tiriti itself, and specifically the things that we know about the negotiations and agreement that occurred on the 5th and 6th of February 1840. Despite the terrible injustice that unfolded after 1840, at that moment there was mutual recognition between Māori and the Crown that as sovereign peoples on these small islands, they needed to negotiate a common future. Most importantly, the British recognised Māori rangatiratanga and sought Māori consent for a shared constitutional future. A treaty was proposed and presented to rangatira in Te Reo Māori and was discussed with the British with the aid of translators. There was a back and forth, a simple human exchange of ideas. That exchange of ideas led rangatira gathered at Waitangi to consent to the terms of Te Tiriti as they understood them. Those terms guaranteed Māori cultural continuity. Te Tiriti or Waitangi presented a simple, bold exchange that established a shared constitutional future. Perhaps the constitutional conversation we look for now between Māori and the Crown can find inspiration in this experience from our past. More importantly, we can learn from our understanding and hindsight of what is required to maintain promises that are made and the constitutional relationships that are developed. In the context of treaty politics today, we can seem a long way away from Tully's vision for constitution making. Even the first hurdle of mutual recognition evades us. Unlike in 1840, the Crown today does not refer to Māori in the language that Māori use to refer to themselves. The Crown does not recognise or speak of Māori rangatiratanga. So where does this leave us? Each year, I teach my treaty politics paper to a new group of students who are growing up in a very different Aotearoa New Zealand to the one that shaped my ideas and values. I'm inspired not only by their fresh approach to well-worn conversations about the treaty, but also by their capacity to open their minds to what might be possible in our political future. Where once I was possibly too radical for some students, I'm now in the wonderful position of trying not to be left behind. I have learned a great deal about our possible constitutional futures from the discussions I've had with these students. I have no idea if these young people were born in Alan Kernow's marvellous year, and whether they will learn the trick of standing upright here. But as I continue my research into Te Tiriti and our constitutional future, I certainly take great heart from their willingness to talk and to listen and their capacity to imagine. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Tēnā koutou nā rangatira, te whānau, tēnā koutou ka haramai, a ka iaku rangatira tēnā koutou. For even someone as apolitical as me, found something to draw on with that presentation. So there you have Janine, and that's Treaty 101 ended for this evening. We expect your assignments to be in the Dropbox by the end of the day. So she's worked on the treaty, for the Treaty of Waitangi, presented at conferences on the treaty, been on treaty research groups, been in the office of the Parliamentary Commissioner on the treaty, and has been involved in a number of professorial lectures and conferences, international and national, on treaty. So if any of you are preparing to engage in some fight for justice, to right treaty wrongs, and to reach independence, sovereignty, and self-governance, then Professor Janine Haywood is at your service. So from the lecture, she posed the question, what's the range of one's political imagination? But the recent politics here in New Zealand, and Winston Peters standing in the middle of the waka up there, maybe there aren't any boundaries. But the treaty, where has it struggled historically? What are its implications in its application today? Where will constitutional transformation take New Zealand into the future? And what shape will New Zealand's identity and nationhood take? And all of us here this evening, after hearing that lecture, will play an important role in that, whatever shape that may inform that may take. So in recognition of this milestone, the trainer, Janine, the university presents this gift to you. I think it's the original version of the Treaty of Waitangi. And to take a quote from Janine's lecture, listening is hard to do when one is used to dominating discourse. Janine has allowed her students to talk, and she's been prepared to listen. So it's in that vein, it's really a privilege to thank you all for attending here and enhancing this evening and this occasion for Janine. So the university and Janine and her family invite you all to join the academic party at the University Staff Club to end the celebration for this evening. So tēnā koutou katoa.